Okay, we'll start from here. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the next episode of our Treats Talks, Translational Research Ethics, Applied Topics series going on for a bunch of years. And this is our latest one. We're very happy to have you here with us. Today, our presenter is Nick Oliver, the program manager for the IU Center for Bioethics. I'm very proud to introduce him. Nick comes to us, to our program, about a year and a half ago now, from Wake Forest, where he got his master's in bioethics, and before that was a history major undergraduate. And he's been running the center and running the bioethics and subject advocacy program for the last, whatever it is, about a year and a half. As part of that job, one of the services the bioethics and subject advocacy program provides is designing data safety monitoring plans, and at times that involves designing a board. And it's actually one of the oldest activities of the BSAP group, the bioethics group of the CTSI. Historically, it's just what was added as a task to the general clinical research centers and the CTSIs early on for the bioethicists to help with the idea. And again, Nick will talk to you a little bit about the history and the use and some of the complexities. But we do try to help researchers with designing these and also thinking more deeply about their purpose and how they can serve the goals of research and the goals of performing trustworthy research and protecting patients. So enough of my yammering. I'll hand this off to Nick. I will mention, though, that all of the Treats talks are recorded and their additional information is provided on our website. And that'll all probably be on the slides, or you can always find it by looking for IU Center for Bioethics and clicking on Research Ethics. And also this talk will be archived in the Treats group. So thank you, everybody. Nick, over to you.
Thank you, Peter, for that great introduction. I'm going to start sharing my screen here, and I'll begin. So hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to my Treats talk today. I'll be discussing data safety monitoring plans and some ethical and practical issues researchers might encounter when conducting human subjects research. Can everyone see this presentation okay? All right, given that no one said no, I think we're okay.
Yes,
awesome.
We can.
Okay, so to begin, I'll start with an agenda. First, I'll overview what a data safety monitoring plan is, as well as what a data safety monitoring board is. Next, I'll discuss where a DSMB fits into the overall picture of a research project's organizational chart. And this will be followed by an overview of how to assemble your DSMB and details of who should or shouldn't be on one. And maybe the most important part that people will be curious about is what the criteria are that make DSMBs necessary, or when a DSMP will suffice. Lastly, I'll talk about the mission creep of DSMBs and why it's not recommended to use a DSMB unless required and appropriate. At the end, I'll open up the floor for Q&A. So first things first, let's identify what a data and safety monitoring plan, or DSMP, is. A DSMP is a comprehensive plan to account for the monitoring of a study and to ensure that the research is conducted ethically by protecting subjects, the validity of research data, and the integrity of the project. DSMPs can take many forms, but they should have the following characteristics. A DSMP should document the reporting procedures, the timeline for doing so, and the guidelines on how reporting should be conducted. These will largely depend on the nature of the study, and it should define adverse events and significant adverse events, the unexpected problems that might arise, and protocol violations. This includes details such as severity of adverse events from mild to severe, their relative expectedness, as well as their relatedness to the intervention as required by federal regulations. It should also anticipate and assess the potential risks of a study, considering not only the physiological risks, but also psychological. For example, a DSMP should consider how the informed consent process will be used to protect subjects and what information will be shared with them. Will results be returned to participants? And if so, under what conditions? Lastly, a DSMP should clearly identify the roles and responsibilities of the research team to achieve all of the above. There are a variety of setups that might be applicable. For example, the PI might be able to monitor the data and safety of a small single-site and low-risk study, or a sponsor might take that responsibility for a multi-site, low-risk study. In certain cases, you might need an external monitor, such as a DSMB, a data safety monitoring board. But a DSMP's complexity should be commensurate with the risk of the study. For low-risk studies, fewer precautions are required. Yet there are some basic safety items to consider even for the lowest risk studies, such as data security. It might seem obvious, but researchers should identify where and how the study data is securely stored, whether it's online or physically secured. Some other considerations might be, how will this study protect patients or participants' privacy? Or how will information from outside sources affect subject safety? Naturally, these plans can take a variety of forms, but I like to focus on a subset of these plans that include something called a data and safety monitoring board, which are necessary for certain studies. The primary purpose of an independent data and safety monitoring board is to protect the research subjects through independent analysis of emerging data from the trial. This differs from adverse event reporting, similar but different topic for another day, in that the DSMB can review aggregate and unblinded data as the data accumulates, which identifies significant issues and trends during the study and can recommend changes in the study, including recommending early termination of the study. The DSMB reviews data for both safety and efficacy, and the protections afforded by this review apply to both current subjects and future study subjects if the DSMB identifies the need to modify or even halt the trial. In addition, an independent DSMB protects the credibility of the trial by virtue of its independence from study sponsors and helps to ensure the validity of study results by reviewing data on subject accrual and conducting interim reviews. Typically, the exact responsibilities, meeting, schedule, format, membership, reporting, and documentation are defined in a document called a DSMB charter, which is essentially a data safety monitoring plan within a plan. So here's the question I'm sure you've all been waiting for. When do I need a DSMB? And here's a flow chart that provides the basic overview. The first question you should ask yourself is this clinical research? If it meets the criteria of patient-oriented research conducted with human subjects or on material of human origin, such as tissues, specimens, cognitive phenomena, for which an investigator directly interacts with human subjects, not including in vitro studies that use human tissues that cannot be linked to a living individual, including mechanisms of human disease, therapeutic interventions, clinical trials, or development of new technologies, epidemiologic or behavioral studies, or outcomes research and health services research, you can proceed to the next step in the flowchart. If it doesn't meet that criteria, you still probably want to have a data and safety monitoring plan just to protect the integrity of your study as well as the security of the information that you collect. However, if it is meeting the clinical research criteria, then you should consider, is it a phase 3 or multi-center study? If so, you need to consider the following criteria. Is it a high-risk study? You'll need a DSMB. Is it a blinded study? Is the data protected that you collect from the actual investigators and so that they can't review it during the actual process of the studies? You will need a DSMB. If there's a vulnerable population that's being studied, you'll need a DSMB, etc. This includes no informed consent emergency research, highly favorable or unfavorable endpoints, there's a high-risk population, or most importantly, if your IRB says so. The IRB also has special jurisdiction in defining whether or not your project needs a DSMB. If the IRB agrees that it doesn't need to have a DSMB, then you can proceed using solely the IRB and the data safety monitoring plan as above. However, there are a few exceptions to this. An example might be that there's a single center open label phase 1 or 2 clinical trial. Now, these generally don't need a DSMB since the local investigator will have access to all the data. A DSMP should account for frequent internal monitoring in these cases, but if that's true, then you shouldn't need a DSMB. A multi-center high-risk phase 1 clinical trial shouldn't need a DSMB if there are clear stopping rules for the trial. However, you'll need to define those clear stopping rules or objective criteria identified in your DSMB for this to be, or DSMP to be the case. A DSMB might not be feasible for certain clinical trials that are expected to accrue too quickly to allow for a DSMB to be constituted or to allow complete data safety monitoring. And finally, low-risk behavioral or nutritional phase 3 trials are exempt from DSMB requirements. And before I dive into the details of assembling a DSMB, I'd like to quickly go over a chart that shows how study data moves throughout the organizational unit. First, data is generated at a source location. This raw data is passed on to the DSMB for review. It's unblinded. Or alternatively, this data can be aggregated by a statistical data analysis team. This goes by different names depending on your institution. And they might identify relevant patterns in the data for consideration by the DSMB. The DSMB will then make recommendations to either continue or stop the study, and these recommendations are passed to the steering committee, trial sponsor, or study investigators. Now, these different groups each have the power to stop this or amend the study, and they also might be required to report this information to regulatory agencies or to the IRB. Now, this is a simplified organizational chart, and depending on the complexity of your study or your institution, you might have additional structures in place. So this is not a one-size-fits-all chart. Now, the NIH guidelines state that the membership of a DSMB should reflect the disciplines and medical specialties necessary to interpret the data from the clinical trial and fully evaluate participant safety. The number of DSMB members depends on the phase of the trial, the range of medical issues, complexity in design and analysis, and potential level of risk, but generally consists of 3 to 7 members, including at a minimum, an expert in the clinical aspects of the disease and patient population being studied, 1 or more biostatisticians, and investigators with expertise in current clinical trials conduct and methodology. You might also have ad hoc specialists invited to participate as non-voting members at any time if you would desire additional expertise. Some trials, depending on population and nature of intervention, may be well served by the inclusion of a bioethicist on the DSMB steering committee or advisory panel, but it's not always necessary. When it comes to conflict of interest, here's what you need to know. No member of the DSMB should have direct involvement in the conduct of the study. That means no financial, proprietary, professional, or other interests that may affect impartial, independent decision-making by the DSMB. You should take the following steps to prevent DSMBs from being compromised by conflict of interest. First, by including language in invitations to prospective and ad hoc members of the DSMB that states something along the lines of, acceptance of this invitation to serve on the DSMB confirms that I do not have any conflicts of interests, and clearly define those. You'll also want them to sign a certification that states that they don't have any conflict of interests. And at the beginning of each DSMB meeting, reconfirm that there are no conflicts of interests or potential conflicts. Now, before I open the floor to questions, I just want to touch on the subject of mission creep. While DSMBs are a powerful tool, they are also resource intensive in that there is an opportunity cost to using them. And therefore, it's not advisable to use a DSMB if it's not necessary or appropriate. And to avoid this, consider determining your project's needs before including a DSMB as part of your grant. For those of you from the Indiana CTSI listening now or in the future, or are shy, you can request a BSAP consultation if you have questions about this topic. You can use the link or QR code provided here. Alternatively, if you have questions now, I'm available to take them, and I will open the floor for questions.
People can just unmute and yell the way I am right now. I'll get out of the way in a sec. First of all, excellent, Nick. Thank you. Most importantly, you've succeeded at the hardest task of a Treats talk, which is 20 minutes. And it's always been our goal for it to be a short intro. I didn't mention that at the beginning. And of course, further questions like you mentioned for a consultation or in this discussion. Does anybody have any questions? And if they don't, I might ask or just mention a couple things and see what Nick wants to say.
Well, if people want to ruminate on their questions for a moment or two, I'd like to show off some of the resources I attached as part of this presentation.
Oh, please do.
If you would like to view a DSMP sample or a DSMB charter, I provided links here, and those will also be attached to our webpage after I update it after this presentation, as well as on our website. Additionally, you can link to the direct consultation here, or if you're from IU, I've linked the IU DSMB guidance, as well as a guidance for sponsors should they be watching this. I've also got my citations, additional references, and regulatory references here, should you be interested.
Excellent. I see that Matt has raised his hand. Thanks.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. Hey, Nick, thanks. Great presentation. And you may have hit on this, but I lost as you're at the end of your slide. But what kind of interactions do you think there should be between the DSMB and the IRB, if any?
Thank you for your question, Matt. I'm going to just circle back to my chart here. I'm not certain that the DSMB should directly interact with the IRB. Sometimes there is an indirect connection in that you provide a recommendation from the DSMB to an investigator or someone else on the steering committee. And then though that recommendation is passed on to the IRB for consideration. So it might be the case that a DSMB recommends that a trial is halted and the IRB might disagree. I am not familiar with any cases of that happening.
Well, let me add a little bit, Nick. I have a little more experience, sadly, because of my extended age too, of being on DSMBs. I'm guessing Matt may have as well, maybe even in his previous life when he was a statistician, that being on DSMB is a very interesting experience, kind of like being on a jury. And once you've been on, it's hard to unsee what you just saw, for better and for worse. So I'll say one thing here about your question, Matt, and maybe to expand on Nick's answer. When I've been on DSMBs, people who know me have heard me say this, and Nick, as he prepared for this, heard me say this a lot, is that, there can be a mission creep, Nick mentioned there near the end, where you're on a DSMB, you've collected these high-powered, clinicians, trialists, statisticians, bioethicists, who are the worst, and they sit there and they say, well, this study was designed as a before and after measurement. It really shouldn't have been done as a before and after. It's really much better as a cluster, or a randomized control. I don't know how I feel about this. And usually I'm the guy on the DSP saying, okay, stop, stop. That's not what we're here to do. If you wanted to make that point, you got to be on the IRB and say that it's badly designed for safety of the participants or for advance of science. That's fine, but that's on the IRB. We are the DSMB. We have a charter. We have a charter that the IRB approved, and we are supposed to do what we were said to do, which is stop the study if it's, if it's a blinded study, you tell them to go on. If it's red time, you identify problems with data. That's what we're doing. We're not here to relitigate the review. And actually, I've often been the annoying guy in the room. It's like, stop, we're not talking. So I would say this quite the IRB DSMB relationship. I think Nick actually hit it right on the head that, of course, there's no relationship other than what the charter said. But also that there's this temptation, like, well, I'm reviewing a study, I care about safety, I've got all these thoughts. And although that's wonderful and we should all have thoughts, we should express ourselves in life, we also are regulating something pretty important, which is already being regulated by hopefully a competent IRB. And so actually we have to be careful. So I don't know if that's around the way we're thinking about, Matt, or what were you thinking of in terms of the relationship?
Actually, I've heard some on IRBs that feel they should get any kind of DSMB reports, even interim reports, so that they can factor it into their ongoing safety monitoring of the study. My own both experience and opinion is more aligned to the way Nick has the relationships and as you described, Peter, but I was just curious as to if you've also encountered this desire from IRBs to have more interactions with the DSMBs.
Well, given the DSMB is part of the protocol that the IRB has to approve, have you seen IRBs actually say that? Like, no, sorry, this is a high enough risk study, or it's a blinded study where we really want the stopping rules to be applied. We don't want you just dealing with the investigators separately from us. We want a copy of every report sent to us. I seem to have been on some DSMBs where certainly the reports were being shared with the IRB, or even some concerns that arose outside of the specific charter being shared with the IRB. Have you seen that, Matt? Is that something that you've sort of informal contact, or IRB saying we want more formal contact than maybe the study team expected?
Yeah, I think I've heard all kinds of proposals where even sometimes they want somebody from the IRB to be part of the DSMB and things like that. I do think, typically, as you have outlined here, periodically throughout the study, when the DSMB does meet, there'll be some kind of information that's provided to the sponsors, which will typically also be provided to the investigators if necessary. Often it's just that the DSMB did the review and recommend continuing the study with no changes. Or of course, if there is something, then that would have to be relayed. And then the investigators would report that, whatever that is, to the IRB. But again, I've heard some who are very passionate, some IRB members who are very passionate about feeling that somehow or another they're not getting the information they need to make decisions about renewal of the study or things like that without having insights into the DSMB materials.
How do you feel about that, Matt? And then I'll let Nick go, and then I've got something to say too. Matt, do you feel about that? Do you feel that's appropriate?
I don't. I mean, kind of like you said, I think that what's appropriate is, does this study need a DSMB, and do you have the right people on it? And are you looking at the right things, and are they have the right decision? Or do they have the right choices to make throughout the course of the study? Which, to your point, Peter, is all reviewed prior to the study. But then, maybe it's a statistician in me, but you let the study progress as planned. So that that's my opinion, but I understand the rest, and kind of, even as you alluded to, sometimes it's one thing to plan, it's another thing to see data, and there's things that you didn't think about that happen, and I think maybe that's where there's this concern coming from.
Nick, I don't mean to take up all the air here. Do you have thoughts on this issue? Something you've thought about in preparing this or doing the DSMB consultations that you've done?
Right. So what strikes me is that in the planning phase is really when all of these decisions should be made, and that this should be clearly identified in the charter if you're going to have one, or in the DSMP if that's what you're electing to go with, or forced to go with. Yet I worry that if you plan too much, you might not be the most efficient. And if you underplan, then you're also not being efficient. So there's some happy medium, a Goldilocks zone, if you will, where there's an appropriate amount of planning, but it's hard to define exactly what that is due to the nature of all of these studies having different characteristics.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, Nick. It's sort of that old thing that if you can plan ahead, it'd be great, but so often in life, it's hard to anticipate everything, and the amount of effort that would go in to anticipating every eventuality is not an amount of effort anybody has available or has funded. I'll say this about the issues that are raised here, which I think are very, so first of all, the joke here is that Nick and I both dreamed of having a flow chart like this that was actually like maybe the previous slide, which was like, if you're this kind of study, do this. If you're this kind of study, do this. And we realized very quickly, it's just impossible. I mean, the simplest story about DSMBs, which I tell other people too, is, the idea of a DSMB really, again, as far as I understand the history, and Matt, you may know more actually, or anybody else on this call, is that, you had the arrival, the creation of the idea of a multi-center, blinded randomized study becoming the standard of gold standard evidence in medicine in the 50s and 60s. But suddenly you had these big studies running where nobody knew what was going on in the study because it was blinded data. So you've got multiple sites, you've got blinded data. It's dangerous. If the intervention, which looked so good at the beginning, is killing people, you just won't know until years later. That's not okay. And somebody said, we need a special board that looks at unblinded data. Can't be the PI, because then it's not a blinded study, but it can be a separate independent board. Boom, there's your DSMB. There's a need for it. There's a clear role. I mean, it's but created by the advance of technology, in this case, the technology of science. Then once you have these things, there's this inclination to let them do more. And so this list here, right, of all the kinds of different DSMBs you might want. Oh, it's a high-risk study. The data is not blinded, but it's a high-risk study. Somebody should be looking at data really carefully and making sure it's not dangerous. More dangerous than we thought. Well, I mean, yes and no. Yes, of course. No, why? Maybe if it's unblinded, the study team should be doing that. Those are people's responsibility. And assuming you've got an IRB overseeing, there's no reason to have another arm to have additional oversight. And there is an inclination here, which I'm somewhat attuned to, having been on DSMBs and other situations in medicine and regulation, where, oh, let's have a second pair of eyes looking at this. That can't be bad. No, of course it can be bad, because now you've got two pairs of eyes, or two groups, and they may be deferring to the other group. If they each defer to the other one, then nobody's watching. If they each start doing their own thing, then they're conflicting. It's impossible as a researcher. So there's this fascinating situation that started with a good impulse, clearly necessary in some situations, clear mission creep, or additional situations where it seems like a good idea, and suddenly backfiring and unanticipated consequences. And so that's what's so fascinating about it. And as a team, when we design DSMBs, we're pretty familiar with these kind of issues. We try to avoid them at every stage. And like I said, my way, and through the BSAP program, when we design these, we really do look at the IRB as being, we do not want to in any way supplant the IRB. The IRB is a good and standard arrangement And to the degree which a DSMB or DSMP can help, it should be feeding to the IRB and helping the IRB. And that's one way to avoid the problem. Anyway, those are my thoughts. I mean, I don't know any other thoughts on that. It doesn't answer the problems. It's more of a conceptual framework that that sometimes is helpful when one is involved in the issue of data safety.
One of the things that concerns me is that ethics is not just following the law, and that if you don't meet any of these criteria, it doesn't necessarily mean that you don't need a DSMB. But at the same time, researchers are inclined to have their grants as completed as quickly and efficiently as possible. And if it is legal, some people will have the inclination to meet those minimum standards and those minimum standards alone. So while I'm not sure that the minimum standards are always enough, I'm not sure that considering too many standards is efficient. It's similar to the Goldilocks problem I was talking about earlier, in that you can underplan and you can overplan, and it's hard to know the right amount of planning, especially when you have a legal framework to interpret.
Wonderful. Well, we've got a little panel here of Nick, Matt, and me. Anybody else want to get in with a question or a horror story, perhaps, or a positive experience? Again, please start to talk if you want. There are two more things I'll raise with the DSMBs against from my own experience. One is the idea of recruiting people to serve on them, and Nick touched on this, but I'll just expand on it. That it's a volunteer role usually. Usually there's not much pay or any pay for members of DSMBs, and then you're asking for somebody who is actually, in some cases, completely independent. So separate university, separate department. So somebody who is doing it out of the goodness of their heart. Perhaps they have some kind of motive, like they're friendly or they're interested in the science or something, but it can be sort of funny to recruit. And actually, as the bioethics department for CTSI, some of us be like, oh, that's what you guys can do. You could run all our DSMBs for me. And I say, well, one, that's not actually very good use of my talents. If I'm not a statistician, we need statisticians and trialists and clinicians. Secondly, there are some cases, as Nick said, where you really should have a bioethicist there. And those are some of the DSMBs that I've served on. But that's an interesting question about recruiting the DSMB members. The second thing I wanted to mention is the recruitment issue in DSMBs of reviewing recruitment. On many DSMBs I'm on, especially ones that are high risk, one of the questions for a DSMB is it recruiting at a rate that it can complete its recruitment and complete the science as described? And some people will say the DSMB should be the one to say, sorry, you need 100 people, you only have 4 years of funding, you've recruited 2, and you need to stop now because there's no way you're getting to 100, which means there's no way you're carrying out the study that you were planning on. There's no reason to expose more people to risk, given the scientific goals won't be accomplished. And that is a pretty difficult situation. Unless there was an explicit stopping rule involving recruitment. Most teams will tell you, no, we only got 2 in the first year, but we can get 50 next year. We really can. And occasionally you're sort of the bad boy. In fact, too often I've been on DSMBs which have been like, yep, sorry, we're gonna meet again in 6 months, not in a year. And in 6 months, you have to have improved your recruitment, or we're gonna tell you you can't go forward, which of course no researcher wants to hear. So it's another way in which a DSMB is charged with controlling risk to the subjects in a way that IRBs sort of do not assess recruitment, as far as I know, to see if a study is online to complete its recruitment as planned. More thoughts, or have I used up all the air in the room? A conference room, the Karen Schmidt conference room, anything from our researchers in there? Research staff and Tom? Okay. Jack, since you came back and you have an MD and a master's degree, you have to ask a question. No, you don't. Thank you for coming, Jack. And nice to meet you, Susan. I'm sorry I didn't say hi to you. Matt, anything else?
I can always come up with more things.
don't do what you want. Do as much as you want.
Well, I mean, the other 2 topics that I'd just be interested in perspective on is one in terms of equipoise and how that might evolve. And you can have it both in the setup of just a DSMB seeing it, or if you think about an adaptive study in general. Yeah. And then the second one, maybe more specifically related to DSMBs, would just be indemnification of DSMB members.
Nick, do you have any comments on those things? I'm not sure I understand each question. I may have to ask Matt to explain each one. Do you want to, but Nick, do you want to say anything first before I ask him to explain the equipoise question, and then we'll talk about indemnification, and then we'll be done. We'll cut off Matt. That's it. But thank God he's here, because otherwise we would have been done in 20 minutes. And again, the structure is supposed to be quick intro and then stay on as long as you want to explore the interesting issues. So go ahead, Matt. Do you want to say more about the equipoise question?
Yeah, well, one of the fundamental criteria for the ethical justification for, say, a randomized clinical trial is typically related to equipoise. There has to be a question, there has to be some uncertainty. And then you can argue whether it's uncertainty on the part of the individual investigators or whether it's uncertainty amongst the community or whatever. But either way, there tends to need to be some kind of uncertainty to justify the randomization of folks. And then what can happen, whether it's through a DSMB who gets to see data as it goes on, is they might decide whether there's stopping rules or not for efficacy, that maybe they would struggle with whether there was still equipoise. And then if for those that aren't familiar with adaptive designs are such that there's a continual monitoring of the of endpoints, and you adapt your randomization scheme based on the endpoints. It's typically automated, so nobody necessarily needs to be looking at it. But there is some philosophical question about, at some point in an adaptive design, do you kind of reach the point where you've altered equipoise, or you should have if you let people know where you are. So maybe I hope that was good enough, but that's kind of the question around equipoise.
So maybe I can start to address that. Sure. My view is that an object in motion tends to stay in motion, and that the more people have access to delegating responsibility, the more certainty we think we need. So without clear decision-making, there's always another person we can consult. And without actionable decision-makings, without specific objective criteria to make decisions, you will always need, to consult with someone else. So I think that just highlights the importance of having a DSMP that identifies these actionables objectively in as clear and precise terms as possible. And my concern with an adaptive process is that often we look for additional reasons to be certain that something is safe. And there are good reasons to do that. But we less frequently look at the current regulations that we have and the current systems that we have and go in the other direction, say, I'm not sure that this is a problem that needs to be addressed in this way.
Yes.
I hope that helps.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting question. Matt, this is probably a conversation we'll have to take offline because it gets pretty technical about whether it's a stopping rule or whether it's a loss of equipoise and what that would mean. And you're, again, I think more of an expert on making that distinction in terms of the science and the numbers coming out of a study. The idea of a stopping rule, I believe, and you can correct me, is the idea that you've exited equipoise, right? So you have enough data so far that now you are no longer in the uncertain state. The intervention is better than the standard of care or is worse. And so it's time to stop because the justification for putting people at risk and doing this research has gone away. You and I know, kind of getting to Nick's point, like when do you know when it's enough that a study like the WHI, Women's Health Initiative, was stopped due to risk of estrogen, a decision that was correct, I believe, statistically, but which then became under question later over whether it was appropriate to stop that study. And now that object in motion has stopped. There's no doing WHI again. And it's awkward to know what to do with the data that was sort of, terminated at a certain point. So the question of when it's time to stop, when the risk and burden to participants is now too great to allow a study to go forward, it has to be balanced against the risk and burden to all future patients of having an incomplete data set, which again, some believe WHI is looking back. And so changing a very standard, people know this is about menopause treatment, and there's actually been some shifting lately about menopause treatment in primary care where I practice. Anyway, that's the thing about equipoise. So I don't know if you want to say more about that. Maybe that's good for now, and anybody wants to contact us to continue that conversation. Matt, do you have something you want to circle back to on that? Or are you good?
No, I think it's a great point, and I appreciate Nick's clarity around the stopping rules. I think that is important, and I think Peter, you also raised a good point around what often accompanies a data safety monitoring board is also an actual efficacy stopping rule, which can be related to safety too, if it's a mortality endpoint or something like that, right? And again, those are typically statistically driven, and it is a real challenge sometimes where you can hit the criteria where you have overwhelming statistical evidence for there to be a benefit with some kind of outcome, but you don't have enough accumulated data on safety to make an overall decision. And I have seen us run into that on a number of occasions, and that can also lead to, because once you pull the plug on the study, you can't really do anything again, and then you're just left with this quandary. But it is really, really difficult sometimes. But I guess as we have the opportunity, whether as bioethicists or IRB members or as people designing studies, you do need to work through all the different scenarios and be very, very clear on the stopping criteria. And then I believe you need to stick to it, but that's where other people like to,
Around.
Yeah.
Okay, and then indemnification. Are you saying members of DSMBs get sued, or what is the indemnification issue? We could wrap up.
Yeah, well, I'm not aware that any have ever been sued, but we run into people who insist on indemnification in order to participate in a DSMB. I just didn't know how common that practice was.
It's a great question. I do not know. Nick, have you come across anything about that?
Haven't come across anything, but I will look into it and get back to you.
Great question.
Perfect.
I've run into much more of the payment issue, that people are like, well, why would somebody at a completely different university, volunteer their time to, probably because you'll be the DSMB for their studies. So then, of course, you've got conflict of interest, that sort of thing. So it's hard to get somebody to do something purely altruistically without there being any kind of friendship or a relationship. And so that's been the problem that we've seen in trying to help people populate their DSMBs.
Well, within industry, it is common to pay, and we have fair market value for the time and effort, and because there's review of material and then the actual meetings itself, so it's compensation for the time.
Right. That's the way it should be, to be honest. That's what I believe. I mean, that's a better way to make any conflicts clear, that you're just paying for your work. I
mean, there's people that object to that because now the people, overseeing the safety of our studies are being paid by us, but it's hard for me to imagine how it would work any other way, right?
I'm with you on that. Okay, well, thank you, Nick, for an excellent presentation. Thank you, our audience, and to you out there in video land who are watching this on recording. Please reach out to us. Nick included in the associated materials here on the webpage should include ways for you to reach out to us. We're available to help design and evaluate DSMBs and more generally data safety monitoring plans. Thanks so much.